What's up everyone, welcome back to more Reddit stories about Karens, crazy people, and all that kind of stuff. So as usual, consider hitting that subscribe button for more Reddit content if you're new here, and let's get into today's stories. Landlord tried to exploit me for free labor. I am renting a little house out past the suburbs of the city I am currently working in. It is a little old and the appliances are a bit dated, but it was much cheaper than a 2-bedroom apartment downtown, and I moved around every couple of years for work. My landlord lives out of state and doesn't have anyone local, so for the past year and a half I haven't talked to anyone, just pay my rent on time and keep doing my thing. About 4 months ago, plumbing issues started popping up, and 2 major appliances decided to give up the ghost. I notified my landlord via email and written letter. I rent a lot and have learned to abide by the exact wording in a lease. After several follow-up emails and phone calls, a local handyman showed up to look at everything and provide a quote. After receiving the quote for parts plus labor, the landlord told me flat out that they will not be paying for the repairs. They said that since I am an engineer, they would allow me to purchase parts, install them, and then deduct the cost of the repairs from my rent payment. They said it was either this or learn to make do. I was not super thrilled at this response. I replied back to them saying if they were willing to deduct my time and the cost of the parts from my rent, that I would get started immediately. Thank you very much. They were thrilled to hear it and asked me to send receipts for their records when everything is finished. Great. Now to put together all the pieces and get to work. The first step was to file for an LLC with my current state. Next, I set up some cameras and borrowed a GoPro from one of my hiking mates. I was able to document all the repair process, from me watching YouTube videos of how to do things to me making multiple runs to the parts store to get that piece I didn't know I needed. Here's the kicker. At my day job, I make over $50 an hour. That is what my time is valued at. The final bill for everything has worked out to be about 12% higher than the quoted cost, and the landlord is very upset, but my lawyer added to the email chain has kept them very civil. I was accidentally the downfall for a manager in training who was a total thief. Way back in 2000, I was an adorable, naive 19-year-old working retail at a picture framing place. The management of our shop consisted of our manager, Jenny, the assistant manager, Nick, and me, the third key. For those who don't know, a third key is literally that, a third person with keys. I had the ability to open and close the store and act as manager on duty. But if Jenny or Nick was there, I was just a regular employee. Names changed to protect the not-so-innocent. Jenny was an amazing manager, middle-aged but cool. She was also kind of like the shop mom. She made cookies and was always very in tune with people's emotions. She always knew the right thing to say to make me feel better, and she was a fountain of real-world wisdom. Everybody loved her. She was also an artist, and her work was starting to pick up steam. That, combined with the onset of some health issues, made her decide that retail work just wasn't for her anymore. We were all really sad, but definitely understood. Now Nick was just a college kid and definitely didn't want or really qualify to be promoted to manager. So corporate brought in a manager in training to work as a 4th member of the management. Let's call him Steve. Steve was weird. He was a huge white guy but dressed in clothes that looked like they'd come from Bill Cosby's wardrobe. Loud sweaters in Arizona heat. I was basically a golden retriever puppy and tried to chat with him while teaching him the ropes when it was my turn to have him shadow me, but he just wouldn't engage. It's not just that, but he would stare at me while I worked. Just sit in the office chair and stare. I tried to chalk it up to him just being awkward, but it was creepy. Even when I was trying to teach him something, he would barely interact. When he did talk, it was usually about how amazing he was at his last job, and how low the pay was for managers in our company. It's retail. Remember when I said that Jenny was having issues with her health? She called me one Saturday afternoon when I was off and asked if I'd come fill in for her. Of course I did, and ran down to the shop to relieve her. She was having a really bad day and I was happy to close for her. I also worked the next day, Sunday, and the day after that, Monday. That Monday, our district manager came in while I was manager on duty, and we got chatting. Like I said, I was basically a chatterbox, so this wasn't unusual. He asked me how Steve was doing, and I tried to diplomatically tell the guy Steve was a dud, using the example that on Saturday when I relieved Jenny, he had just sat in the office or wandered the floor the whole night. The district manager seemed a little startled. But not about the guy's behavior, but by the fact that Jenny hadn't been in the store after 3 p.m. After being in our store for about 6 weeks, Steve started swapping out with another store in the neighboring city and acting as manager on duty by himself. Steve was thrilled because he actually lived in this other city, and the rest of us just assumed this was part of his training. Not so much. It turns out that there'd been a whole lot of shrink happening at our store. A huge uptick in people paying with credit card and then coming back later and getting a cash refund. Back then, if you did a return on a credit card or debit, it took a few days for the money to show back up in the account. If people got mean about it, we could do a cash refund, but it had to be approved by a member of the management by signing in with their register code and using their key. Thousands of dollars worth of returns were being done in cash, multiple times a day, when before we'd have maybe 1 or 2 a week. What's worse is that it appeared that Jenny was the one doing all these returns. They seemed to think that Jenny was taking all she could before she retired. That is, until I told the district manager about filling in for Jenny. Apparently, a very large $750 credit card transaction had been returned that night, around 7 p.m., and Jenny's code was the one used. When I said she wasn't even there, in my naive way I had saved her. It turns out that Jenny had just given Steve her register code to train him, because it took a few days for him to get his own because of some computer glitch at corporate. After my offhand remark, they took a closer look at our old schedule on paper. The management team didn't clock in and out, and realized that half these returns were happening on days when Jenny wasn't even there. So they switched Steve to the store in the other city, which had a better surveillance system, and caught him using another employee's code to pull the same trick, as well as flat out pulling cash from the till. I'm not sure what the actual charges were, but from what I heard, he was very startled when he showed up to work to find the district manager and 2 sheriff detectives waiting in the other store's office for him. He was literally perp walked out in handcuffs. I was so upset that they didn't do it in our store. Jenny ended up leaving shortly after. The stress was just too much for her. Nick was made temporary manager, and he and I split opening and closing duties for a couple months. I mostly opened and he would close. There were a few managers from around that would sub in to give us days off. Then we finally got a new manager who'd been entirely trained at other stores. He was okay, but he was no Jenny. Thankfully, he was no Steve either. Don't believe inhalers are needed? Have fun losing your job. So this is actually a story that my mom told me from when she was in 8th grade. She had this art teacher, we'll call her Mrs. X, who absolutely hated her. She was an older lady with only 1 year left before retirement. This will be important later. My mom had PE right before her art class, and she also has really bad asthma. She had left her inhaler in her locker, and when she was let out late of gym, she decided to go straight to art, drop off her backpack, and then asked to go grab her inhaler from her locker. Mrs. X, having hated my mom for some time, told her to wait until announcements were over and then she could leave. She decided not to fight and to go wait for announcements. My mom's friends were ticked and they knew she had terrible asthma, so they were trying to convince her to just leave the classroom because Mrs. X didn't deserve her attention, being the witch she was. My mom said no and waited patiently until she was allowed to leave. Once the announcements were over, she went to Mrs. X asking if she could finally leave. Her response was, "Well, if you had enough oxygen to sit there and talk to your friends rather than listening, then I don't think you need your inhaler." At this point, my mom is wheezing and had started to get a headache from not being able to breathe. But again, she listens to her teacher, not wanting to get further on her bad side, and waits for class to end before she can grab her inhaler. Her friends continue telling her to just leave since she isn't doing any work anyway, but she tells them to just wait, knowing full well how her body reacts to asthma attacks. At the end of class, her friends booked it with my mom's locker combination to grab her inhaler because my mom was in no shape to run. However, when they finally brought it to her, she couldn't take in enough air for the inhaler to be of any help. Her friends rushed her to the nurse's office, where they told her about Mrs. X and how my mom couldn't breathe. The nurse ended up having to call an ambulance. My mom was rushed to the hospital, admitted into the ICU, almost had to get intubated, and was there for 10 days. Her parents were furious, and my grandfather was ready to sue the entire state. The school, knowing that Mrs. X was only a year away from retirement and not wanting to take away the benefits she'd earned from staying, ended up striking a deal with my grandparents. My mom no longer had to take art, even though it was a required class for 8th grade, so she aided for the counselors that period. The school district was also in charge of paying for my mom's medical bills. My grandparents wanted her to lose her job but agreed to the terms. But the story doesn't end there. My mom's brother, who was in 7th grade at the time of the incident, had to take sculpting the next year with Mrs. X, her last year. A few weeks into the class, my grandparents got a letter informing them that my uncle was failing art. When confronted, he told them that on the first day of school, he had asked Mrs. X a question and she had accused him of being disrespectful. As punishment, she made him sit in a room that branched off from the main classroom. Every day afterwards, she would falsely accuse him of something and force him to sit in that room, where he couldn't get any work done, hence why he was failing. My grandmother called up the school district in a rage, telling them that the original agreement was now off because Mrs. X was unfairly taking out her rage on my uncle, and that they were ready to sue. Because the school district never thought to get my grandparents to sign a contract saying they wouldn't sue, they were forced to fire Mrs. X, much to the delight of my mother. She never got the benefits from retirement. Edit, just to clear up some confusion, since I asked my mom some clarifying questions. She didn't listen to her friends and leave the classroom because she knew she was going to have an asthma attack and wanted to get Mrs. X in trouble after class. She was expecting a quick trip to the nurse's office where she could tell on the teacher, but it ended up more severe than she intended. It's one of the reasons why she'll never leave the house without an inhaler on her. She also followed up the story telling me to never do what she did, because she won't be as forgiving as my grandparents were. Hey, it's me, let me in. A small but funny thing that happened about 20 years ago. I had opened a small store inside a co-op building. My shop had a side door that was supposed to be an exit, but was unlocked during business hours. People would come in that door, which became a problem. It was a tight space, so people shopping in the aisle near the door would sometimes get hit by incoming patrons opening the door without looking, or run over by co-op patrons trying to cut through. So we ended up locking this door from the outside. Shoppers would then have to come in the main entrance, but could exit the side door. The side door had a large window in it, so we put a sign at about eye level that this door is an exit only, and to go to the main entrance, about 15 feet to the right. People would literally peer around the sign to make eye contact, and then knock. Like, hey, it's me. I don't have to walk 15 feet to the main entrance. Let me in. I ended up wrapping a piece of cardboard with paper and blocked the whole window so they couldn't see inside. They still knocked, but I could ignore them. Also, silver lining was I varied the paper based on the seasons, so it was a fun thing to do. And that's going to be it for today, friends. Thank you for watching, I appreciate it. And as always, if you enjoyed, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more Reddit shenanigans. So take care, and I'll see you next time.